decision by a court of higher authority or a judicial decision related thereto. Cause of death. Determination of the mode and manner of person's death by a coroner or a medical examiner. Defendants. Those who defend a lawsuit against them. In a criminal case, those who seek acquittal. Equivocal death. A disputed or undetermined death. Forensic ethics. Ethics especially related to judicial or semi-judicial proceedings. Manner of death. Answers the why in the mode of death. Mode of death. What made the person die? Plaintiffs. Those who initiate the lawsuit. Psychological autopsy. Tools and methodologies to investigate an equivocal or undeterminate death. Also used in suicide research. Standard of care. The standard to which professionals are held by law and ethics to conduct their professional conduct. Acting beneath that standard of care carries ethical or legal sanctions and sometimes both. Introduction. Psychological autopsy. Definition and usage. The goal of the psychological autopsy is to reveal the thoughts and attitudes of the deceased prior to his or her death. It is a tool and a method of analysis that uses the deceased past records and behavior as well as current interviews with those around them. This study seeks to discern the deceased's state of mind prior to death. Psychological autopsy are used for both research and forensic purposes. In research, psychological autopsies are used to investigate the nature and pattern and causes of suicide. In forensic investigation, psychological autopsy are used to investigate what are most often called as equivocal deaths. These are disputed deaths where the intention or the will of the deceased cannot be determined, such as between an accident, a suicide and a homicide. The psychological autopsy is a methodology and instrument used to help determine the manner of death as opposed to the mode of death. The mode of death is what a coroner can determine. This distinction is illustrated in a case before law where a woman was found unconscious and face down in an empty bathtub. Medical personnel tried to revive her, but she later died in the hospital. A physical autopsy revealed the consumption of antidepressants, including approximately 20 tazamipam tablets. The medical examiner ruled that she drowned because she was incapacitated from the drug and that it was not taken accidentally. However, physical autopsy could not determine whether her death was a suicide or a homicide. The psychological autopsy for the state, rendered by the clinical psychologist, suicidologist, and the executive director of an American Association of Suicidology, figured prominently into the criminal trial, and her husband was indicted for first-degree murder. Experts conducting a psychological autopsy issue findings based upon research of the deceased and relate them to the specific issues at trial. Today, psychological autopsies are used in one form or another around the world. They employ a range of studies, adapted and adopted, to fit the needs of the study, the availability of evidence, and the demographics and cultures in which they work. Therefore, psychological autopsies allow for a variety of disciplines and expertise, with sensitivity to the bereaved and the cultures from which they come. Validity and reliability of psychological autopsies. Due to the widely disparate nature, purposes and disciplines of researchers and environments in which they are, autopsies will be used. The validity and reliability of the psychological autopsy have been very unclear, even controversial. Researchers have noted that criterion validity is nearly impossible because if the truth about the deceased's intention could be known for certain, there would be no need for a psychological autopsy in the first place. In 1993, researchers conducted a systematical analysis of equivocal death analysis (EDA) protocol to investigate the lethal explosion aboard the battleship USS Iowa in 1989. A panel of experts independently reviewing the EDA reached a consensus only for broad categories. More recently, the medical model of psychological autopsy have been criticized through the studies of suicides of UK group. The studies that sample of narratives from the victims of the suicide or open verdict deaths favored moral categories over the medical ones, often favored the psychological autopsies. Additionally, the reliability of psychological autopsy has been studied cross-culturally. Researchers applied a psychological autopsy emphasizing cultural and social factors to 66 suicide victims, 66 living controls. They found validity in applying the Western psychological autopsy approach to their Chinese sample. Significant strides have been made in assessing the reliability of psychological autopsies as valid tools for both scientific research and forensic investigations. Legal requirements of psychological autopsy testimony. Beyond the scientific demands of pure research, psychological autopsy must also adhere to legal standards where they serve the forensic functions. Psychological autopsies often become a court, coroner's and insurance record. Legal requirements and certainly the professional requirements of social science demand both valid and reliable research. In US law, the Federal Rule of Evidence 702 requires that judges determine whether or not the research methodology conforms to appropriate scientific rigor. That standard is neither rigid nor infinitely flexible. It requires that the trial courts avoid unproven theories and methodologies. A Louisiana appellate court affirmed the admittance of a medical doctor who performed a psychological autopsy. The descendant's wife unsuccessfully challenged the will on the grounds of incapacity, arguing the doctor's testimony, which was based upon medical records, the executed wills, and the various parties, did not meet the legal standard for expert testimony. The appeals court ruled that the expert and his methodology met the 702 standard. In another challenge to an expert psychological autopsy testimony, U.S. Federal District Court in Georgia allowed a medical doctor to testify even though he was not qualified in the practice of many specialties at issue in a case alleging medication caused suicide. The physician was not a suicidologist, psychopharmacologist, epidemiologist, or an expert in U.S. drug regulation and testing. He was a board-certified psychiatrist with over 40 years' experience and had significant, the court's word, training and education in suicide research. The court ruled that an expert need not be certified or admitted to the specific field under consideration. The methodologies. Determining the manner of death when the deceased is unavailable for contemporaneous interview and testing requires a different investigative tools and skills. In equivocal deaths, this challenge is further complicated by bereavement issues, incomplete memories of interviewees, reluctance to speak about the dead, and the legal complications such as insurance issues, as well as the lack of essential facts without the likelihood of ever retrieving them. Flexible and adaptive techniques towards the purpose have been used for over 50 years. These protocols examine the lifestyle, medical, social, emotional histories, character evidence and traits, and anything else that bears upon the descendant's intentions related to his or her death. Such a study is inevitably broad, interdisciplinary in approach, and must be unbiased. Schneidman, a pioneer of an early and still used protocol of the psychological autopsy, helpfully distinguishes the psychological autopsy from a physical autopsy, such as what a coroner might produce, a forensic investigation to discover the perpetrator, and statistical and demographic reports to study who is at risk for suicidal behavior and ways to mitigate against him or her. It is sometimes tempting to blur one study with another. The methodologies for conducting a psychological autopsy allows room for adaptation to circumstances. As early, if not the first, published methodology in the modern era was instituted by Schneidman in 1976 and another was done by Ebert in 1987. Both these important contributions investigate a wide range of medical, social, psychological, emotional and behavioral documentary evidences, including suicide note, coroner report about the deceased. The Queen's Bench in Alberta, Canada heard 2 psychological autopsies in a case where a teenage man died from carbon monoxide poisoning. His family sued the school board for negligence, alleging that the humiliation, stress and embarrassment in an incident at school caused his death. The defendant's expert, a psychiatrist, testified that the young man was not so humiliated or stressed as to commit suicide. The plaintiff's expert, a clinical psychologist, testified that the stress and embarrassment over the incident may have contributed to his death. Importantly, neither of the experts believed that the cause of death was suicide as determined by the medical examiner. Both experts interviewed almost the same players in the man's life, including teacher, parent, friend, employer, and both experts reviewed documentary evidence including school record, police report of the school incident and his death, and the medical examiner's report. Each concluded that the most likely theory was his death being an accident, and the judge was persuaded. The crucial difference between the expert testimonies was that the plaintiff's expert concluded it was likely that the stress of the school incident contributed to the accident. Defendant's conclusion was that such a stress did not. A study that surveyed 94 US medical examiners about the factors they used to determine a child's suicide revealed that the 5 most used factors in descending order were the suicide note, history of suicidality, psychological history or diagnosis of medical illness, medical history, and pre-suicide behavior. A psychiatric examination of Ernest Hemingway's suicide-used biographies of the writer, personal correspondence, the writer's own literature, photographs, as well as medical records. Snyder, Hain and Bergman offer a standardized yet flexible protocol. This protocol is included as appendix for 2 reasons. First, it is specifically designed to comport with the court scrutiny of expert testimony. Second, it is clear, cogent and comprehensive. Even with all its variants, researchers find psychological autopsies to be the most informative and useful method for research into suicide behavior. This well-deserved respect, as will be seen, does not immunize the psychological autopsy from critics for its reliability, validity from both the demands of science and scrutiny of courts. Other protocols for psychological autopsies. Some researchers have offered their own protocols, particularly with a view to create a more standardized procedure while allowing for appropriate flexibility. Given the debate on the reliability and validity of psychological autopsies, researchers have emphasized the need for a standardized protocol that meets both scientific and forensic standards within the context of equivocal death and the issues at trial. Many researchers use a semi-structured interviewing process, which leaves the interviewee time to elaborate on the questions asked. A semi-structured interview for psychological autopsy with broad characteristics such as stressors, motivation, lethality, and intent was described by the Verlang and Bottega. Additionally, Campayo, Alvarez, and co-workers have adopted a standardized polyvalent psychiatric interview into a new psychological autopsy tool to be used with depressed patients. They call this semi-structured interview the biopsychosocial autopsy. Ethical elements in psychological autopsies. Legal scholars have recognized how experts run afoul of ethical and legal standards, including violating their licensing boards, losing their testimonial immunity, and testifying below a standard of care for expert witnesses. The standard of care is the line above which there is no liability or guilt, or below which there is either guilt or liability. Oregon's appellate court upheld the state licensing board's disciplinary action against a member, a psychologist, for making recommendation in a child custody case where the mother was a client and the psychologist did not interview the husband. The court ruled that the board had a proper standard against a psychologist who did not disclose potential bias and presented a testimony that lacked validity and reliability. Experts must comply with the ethical standards of their respective professions when making recommendations, writing evaluations, and testifying in court. Researchers have also tested the impact of psychological autopsy interviews on the interviewees. A research study in UK found interviewing two persons at the same time could yield conflicts between the interviewees when they disagree on their view of the dissident's death or life situation. The study suggested that as strong emotions, including shame and guilt, could accompany such interviews, the interviewer might offer referral to counseling resources as part of the investigative process. Additionally, the study found that the boundary issues could occur between an interviewer and the counselor. Some information which was undisclosed in an interview could be revealed when issues are explored in depth during a counseling session. The study raised the ethical concerns about how counseling information is used, including informed consent offered or available for research purposes. The study also noted the need for ongoing supervision of the interviewee. It concluded that while interviewing process did no harm and may have been helpful to the interviewee, researchers should approach their task with empathy and caution. In another UK study, researchers conducted a follow-up session for those interviewed in previous studies of high suicide risk groups, that is, young adult, farmer, and doctor. The sample group was asked to assess their reactions to the interviews on suicide risk. The study found that 96% preferred being sent a letter by the initial researchers themselves, while 22% reported being upset by the interview. A month later, only one interviewee reported feeling worse than usual. In contrast, one-third of the respondents reported feeling better after the interview. While all were offered bereavement information following the initial interview, less than half accepted the offer. Among those who received the information, however, 90% reported it as being helpful. The study called for follow-up evaluation after conducting interviews on suicide risk and practice of steps that insulate against the negative effect of the interviewing process. However, it must be emphasized that both mentioned researchers indicate that interviewing about a suicide need not in itself cause harm. In fact, the participants can derive some benefit from the interview. The benefit may flow from the manner in which the interview is conducted and the follow-up afforded to the interviewees. Recommended documentation or archival records. They are medical records, police records, legal records, criminal records, school records, financial records, suicide note, military records, autopsy report, toxicology report. Then regarding site of death, decedent's relationship to the site, evidence of rescuability versus precaution, evidence of planning and or rehearsal. Then regarding demographics, immigrant status, acculturation issues, residence relative to recent mobility, socio-economic status, employment and financial status, age, gender and race, marital status, educational status, religion and religiosity, adopted versus biological family status. Next, about recent symptoms and behaviors. Appeared depressed, sad, tearful or moody, displayed symptoms of depression, expressed symptoms of depression, expressed suicidal ideation or thoughts of death, appealed to have made a change for the better, appeared anxious or complained recently of anxiety, appeared agitated, behaved in an impulsive manner, displayed uncontrolled rage or aggressive behavior, demonstrated constricted thinking, tunneled vision, disclosed feelings of guilt or shame, appeared confused, disoriented or psychotic, expressed feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, mental status, evidence of impaired memory, poor comprehension, poor judgment, hallucinations or delusions, showed an inflated sense of self or signs of magical thinking, engaged in excessive risk-taking behavior. Next, precipitants to the death regarding them. Had the decedent recently experienced or was decedent anticipating any of the following: significant loss or losses of relationship, job, finance, prestige, self-concept, family member, moving, anything of importance to the person. Next, significant or perceived significant, disruption of a primary relationship, legal troubles or difficulties with police, an event which was or was perceived as traumatic, significant life changes, negative as well as positive, example marriage, birth of a child and promotion, successful suicide or suicidal behavior of a family member or a loved one, the anniversary of an important death or an important other loss or another significant anniversary, exposure to the suicide of another through the media or personal acquaintance, his or her death or as evidenced by recently making preparation for death, example updating a will, insurance policy, expression of a wish to reunite with a deceased loved one or to be reborn, psychiatric history regarding that, prior suicidal behaviors, any prescribed psychotropic medication for anxiety, depression or psychosis, observed adverse reaction, intolerable side effects, lack of compliance, hospitalization in a psychiatric setting where when and diagnosis, whether a therapist or a psychiatrist, pharmacologist, other primary care provider was consulted, being in therapy at the time of death, if so duration, quality of therapeutic alliance, compliance with treatment, diagnosis, expression of concern about going crazy or of losing cognitive functioning. Now about physical health, recent visit to a physician, experiencing chronic pain, recent past diagnosis, concern regarding chronic fatal disabling disease, recent reduction in physical functional capability, current medication, if so compliance, recent changes in dosage or prescription. Regarding substance abuse, history of alcohol or drug abuse, recent attempts to discontinue alcohol or drug abuse, recent increase in pattern of abuse, degree of alcohol or drug abuse at the time of death, evidence of binge drinking, patterns of polysubstance abuse, history of accidental overdose, if so when and what drug. About family history, a sibling or a parent who died on unnatural death, level of support or observed closeness in nuclear extended family, significant physical, sexual or emotional abuse, substance abuse, suicide, violent behavior, presence of affective disorder or other mental health disorders in the family. About firearm history, firearm ownership, recently purchased or otherwise obtained a weapon, if so for what purpose, care for weapons, what was the characteristic pattern of cleaning gun, storage pattern of weapon, accidental discharge of firearm. Next, about attachment and social support, ability to create and maintain close personal relationships, presence of a close confidant, ability to express feelings as needed, especially grief and anger in relationship, recent talk about feeling unsupported, uncared for, unimportant in relationship, relative success in personal relationship, work, attachment to hobbies, interest and religion, recent changes in any relationship to the above attachment. Next, about emotional reactivity, history of violence towards others, impulsive behavior, excessive rage or other uncontrolled aggressive behavior. Next, about lifestyle and character, typical coping pattern, perfectionism, self-destructive behavior, frequent crisis, often those appearing self-created, victimization behavior, then about access to care, history of help-seeking behavior, known barriers to health care. Other areas of inquiry: occupational history, hobbies, interest, gambling history, degree of religiosity and religion. So that completes psychological autopsy.